you know, a hot issue these days and has been for years. It's just not had that much attention. And if I have time, I want to talk a little bit at the end on some of the impact that COVID-19 has had on staff and what that means for care quality and quality of life for residents. I chaired the Royal Society report that came out almost exactly 2 years ago now. And we were asked to look at the impact of COVID-19 on long-term care and its future. We did a lot of work in a very short time because the Royal Society wanted this report in front of the Senate before they rose for the summer. And we're in negotiations right now about whether we'll update it. We couldn't boil the entire ocean in this report. We did quite an extensive look at the roots of why the situation was so dire at this point in time during COVID in long-term care. And I'd encourage people to go and have a look at least at the executive summary. We came up with a set of recommendations, but we didn't make all the recommendations in the world that could be made. We sat down one day and had a moment and said, we can't boil the entire ocean. This is a really incredibly complex and large area. And the things that have gone wrong have a lot of different causes coming from different levels. And we said, if there was one thing we could recommend to people that they do that would make the biggest impact on what was happening in long-term care, what would it be? And it only took us less than half a minute to say, well, it's the workforce. We have to address the workforce issues. And that's still the same conclusion we would reach now. And it will be a part of what happens in the standards, but they're just standards, as Samir has gone through, and a part of what we'll be having discussions about over the next while. And I'll just declare up front that I know that addressing the staffing issues costs money. And I've heard a lot all of my career and will continue to hear that there is no money for this. I don't actually believe that. I think there's enough money in the system. It has to do with how we prioritize it and where we spend it. And that has to do with what we value. And so at the core, the issues in long-term care during COVID and prior to COVID and going forward will be issues not so much of money as of the value we place on a life that's been lived. And that's the bottom line issue that's at work here, or at least that's my hypothesis. So why is staffing important to talk about? It's pretty well established in the literature that it matters, and in practice, that it matters for quality of care, it matters for resident quality of life, and it matters for quality of work life for the staff, the kind of mix and numbers and amounts of staff that you have. And why does staff quality of work life matter? Why should we care? Because it also affects the residents in a really profound way, as anybody on the webinar knows from any personal experiences they've had, professional or otherwise. There are 3 ingredients needed to look at staffing in a balanced, reasonable way. And some of this is as obvious as the nose on our faces, and some of it has levels and complexities that haven't been as obvious, perhaps. We need to know what the resident population is that we're serving. We need to know what the composition and character of the workforce is. And we need to know both the physical and the non-physical or social and psychological work environment is. Those all play really importantly into the numbers and types of staff that we need. So I want to look first, I'll look at these one by one at the residents. The residents today are not the residents of 20 or 40 or even 15 or 10 years ago. The residents sometimes get characterized as a homogeneous mass of similar people who are old. That's the common denominator. And notwithstanding that there's a proportion of people in nursing homes or long-term care homes or care homes that are younger. I'm not going to talk about that group today. This group of residents is as complex as our society. They're multiracial, they're multicultural, they have all sorts of sexual and gender identities, they have all sorts of occupational backgrounds, they have all sorts of life histories. Everything that's in society, every characteristic you can imagine ends up as a characteristic of residents in nursing homes. They are us when we get there. We are not going to not need nursing homes at any point in the foreseeable future unless we cure dementia, and there's nothing anywhere on the scientific side of things to suggest that that's on the horizon. The best we can do with dementia, which is a major driver for care homes, is to delay its onset. So between dementia and frailty and the kind of things that happen with chronic diseases, we will continue to need nursing homes. We will not continue to need them in the numbers that we have now if we do some really important things around alternate and supportive living and home care and aging in place and the kinds of supports that people need. But whether those things are done, the jury's out on that. I will show you a slide in a minute where in Alberta, there's been a very aggressive move toward aging in place and keeping people from nursing homes until they absolutely need it. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the unintended consequences of that. So we must know our populations. And why do we need to know our populations? Because their care needs differ. If we really truly believe in person-centered care, and we talk a lot about it, we have to incorporate the individual things that each of us would bring if we were in a nursing home to the setting to understand what's needed to support that individual. So that's a pitch for don't think of nursing homes, if you're not familiar with them, as places where everybody's the same. They're just as wonderfully diverse as society is. This is a slide I was talking about. So this is over a period from about 2008 till 15. In around 2006-7, these policies are put in place in Alberta. And what you see there is what happened to length of stay in Calgary and Edmonton in those regions over that period of time. It plummeted. The average length of stay is about 15 months in Alberta. In Winnipeg, where we had data, Winnipeg region, the length of stay actually climbed up a bit. And if you talk to people in Winnipeg, they will tell you, people in the know, that that is because they have a fairly significant proportion of people in their care homes in Winnipeg who do not need that level of care. And so they're working to change this. That's the good news. You can drive down the length of time that people are in care homes. The other flip side of that is that when you do that, you raise the level of complexity and dependency, and not just medical complexity, but social complexity of the population you have in nursing homes. If we were talking in acute care parlance, we would say that their acuity has gone up. And we've done that while we've held staffing absolutely flat for all intents and purposes. And what we've done is created over time a net deficit, a bigger and bigger and bigger gap in terms of the supply of staffing meeting the needs of residents. That is a very significant part of why COVID had such a catastrophic impact in long-term care. It's not the only reason, but it's certainly a major contributor. The next thing we need to look at is what's the composition of the workforce, and very much like the residents in Alberta, about 20% of the workforce, the frontline care aide or PSW or workforce, are white. So this is a wonderfully rich mix of cultures and races and languages. And the dominant cultural or racial group varies by province. In Alberta, it's carries from the Philippines. In the Toronto area, it might be from the Caribbean nations. In Quebec, it might be from Haiti. It depends on where you are in the country. It's not the same everywhere. The Atlantic provinces and some places in BC and some places in different provinces are quite different and still quite Northern European in their character of their workforce. That will change over time. So we have this wonderfully diverse group looking after another wonderfully diverse group, and it matters, but we haven't really factored into our staffing calculations what it means when 70% of your staff are from different cultural groups and speak English as a second language. And while English is the language of work, there are all sorts of unanswered questions about whether that's a factor in the kind of care that's delivered, and should we have different sorts of requirements in that regard. So that's the second thing, the paid workforce in long-term care, about 80 and 90% of care is given, as you know, by unregulated care aides, called different things in different provinces. They're an older female racialized workforce that are generally poorly remunerated compared to other workers. They're the least well remunerated workforce in healthcare. Many work in casual, non-benefited positions. Um, about a third of them pre-pandemic were working in more than one nursing home, off and almost entirely to make ends meet when we've surveyed them. So this is a vulnerable, marginalized workforce looking after a vulnerable, marginalized population of residents. And they're under extraordinarily high levels of stress, but they also have this really interesting feature when we do some work with them in terms of reporting high levels of this thing we call job efficacy, the sense that their work has meaning and is important. So if you look at this slide, this is complex, but I'll just take it apart. The top two pieces of this are the bad parts of burnout. The scale has these funny three subscales in it. And the bottom piece is about this sense that your work has meaning. So as you can see, if you look at the bottom, the care aides are on the top bar, and then there's RNs, LPNs, and allies. They have this just crazy high reporting of the sense that their work has meaning. That is probably one of the important contributors to why it wasn't worse in long-term care. It's probably also potentially a buffer against, if you go up to the top two groups, and just look at the top line for simplicity, and you see that on the exhaustion and cynicism scales, which are the ones that put you at risk for burnout, there are really high proportions of care aides in the high risk category. And there's a significant number in all the work groups. So this was pre-pandemic. This was a workforce under significant duress, and we were not doing much, if you take the system as a whole, to really even, well, we weren't measuring it for the most part. Most of the measurement and assessing has been done in the context of research projects. So if you don't know what's going on, I suppose we don't have to address it, but we certainly can't address it. Then the third ingredient we need to, I know I'm going quite fast, but I want to not be over time here. The third ingredient, if you want to plan staffing well, is you need to understand the work environment. And that's the physical plant as well as all the other components. So we do not have to have physical plants the way some of ours are, but we do. And so one of the tasks in front of us, and partly being driven by COVID and the impact of old institutional buildings with 2 and 4 bedrooms, part of the infection management of infection spread was highlighted by COVID. So for example, last year in July, they decreed an end to 4 bedrooms in Alberta. That's one of the things that come out of the review we did. And I think we'll see more of that. But it's not just the 2 and 4 bedrooms and the fact that the buildings are old, and that often factors into how you cover your floors and your units. But there's a move and a trend towards small facility living. And in fact, in places like the Netherlands and Denmark, and in some places in Canada, and in a few places in each province, we're moving to small facility living and moving to different models of care. Green farms are one of my personal favorites. They're small hobby farms where the older adults contribute to, as they can as their dementia progresses, to the gardens and to food preparation and to animal care and to gathering the eggs and all those sorts of things. That helps significantly in both keeping their activity levels up, but also giving them a sense, even in their circumscribed world, that life has purpose and meaning, and that they interact in a community, and there's a level of connectedness. There are also dementia villages. There are all sorts of models. There are homes that have really structured animal assisted programs, whether it's horses or potbelly pigs or dogs. I'm not talking about random pets. I'm talking about structured approaches. So the work environment isn't just the physical plant. The physical plant's important. Many of you who've worked in acute care know that it's a lot easier and more efficient to staff an open 12-bed ICU than it is 12 single rooms. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have 12 single rooms, but it does mean that it changes how you have to staff the place. But the work environment is also the soft things, the leadership. The leadership's so critical. The kind of culture it is it a culture of support and valuing of the worker and of the resident? Is there good teamwork? Is there good communication? Are care aides and nurses and others engaged in decision making? do people have a perception that they have a buffer with which they can manage if things get tough? So there's a whole thing that constitutes work environment that's really important when you think about staffing. We've discovered that staff's perceptions of having enough staff, regardless of whether they have any more staff than anybody else, can be as influential in terms of the care delivered and their quality of work life as actual staffing numbers. That's about the culture and environment and the kind of leadership you have. We've done some measurement because we're a research group of the environment. And this is just, I think I have 2 slides here. This is about the staff's physical and mental health scores in environments that are more favorable. That's the green bars. You see higher levels of physical health and higher levels of mental health. And those are pretty hard to move measures. They're off of the SF8, which is part of the SF36, and on for those of you interested. And you see that in green environments or more favorable environments, there are less care tasks missed, like walking and sleep prep and talking with residents and dressing and toileting and feeding. So your work environment matters. It matters a whole lot to the quality of care and quality of life. And I want to make a comment about minimum hours of care. There are a lot of things, and some of them are on this slide, that go into determining the kind of staff you need. And there are arguments in the literature, if you're interested in that, about, oh, we should have minimum hours, we shouldn't. The long and the short of that is that generally most jurisdictions do eventually go to minimum hours of care, and it's minimum hours necessary to provide the minimum level of care below which, if you don't provide it, quality will fall off measurably. So we love in Canada to say we are going to put 4 hours or 4.1 hours of care in place, as if that would fix everything. We had somewhere around 3.2 as an average across Canada before the pandemic, and most jurisdictions, or many, are moving toward 4. 4.1 was a number established in 2001, 21 years ago, in the United States of America, a very different context, at a time when the resident population was very different. So 4.1 is not going to be enough, but it is a terrific start to start raising the level of care. If you talk off the record, because there's not a lot published yet, to people who've been doing staffing work for years, they will say, they've said to me, Carol, 5.7 is a much more realistic number, and we probably need to be pushing it towards 6.5. So we have a long way to go. If we don't regulate minimum hours of care, it will be difficult to get consistent levels across the country. So it's a big hill to climb, and we have to start, and we have to look at not just the raw numbers, but we have to look at the mix. There has never been a study done in Canada in the history of our country that looked across provinces at what is the magic number in Canada. I'm sure if we did it, it would be in the 5 to 6 range. And we would do that by looking at different levels of staffing and looking at resident outcomes and trying to find a sweet spot where we had a good minimum level. So just keep in mind that 4.1 is a really important goal, but that was a goal set 20 years ago when things were very different. If you want to read more about staffing, I did a review last year, and I think the slides will be available so you can find it there. I've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to talk for a minute about something I think we've been hearing about, but we need to pay much more attention to and think about what we're going to do about what happened to the workforce as a result of COVID, and is still happening right now. This was funded by a combination of agencies. So the study was in Alberta, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. It's part of our ongoing program that focuses on the quality areas. And it's called the Alberta COVID study because they were first in with funding, and we just haven't changed the slides, but it looks at it, and we did more in Alberta than we did in some of the other jurisdictions. I want to talk a little bit about some of the findings from the interviews we did last year. We've now just taken about 2 months ago the survey out of the field, and we're analyzing it right now. And there's been some quality of life assessments done with a dementia specific tool. I think Matthias has assessed about 700 residents 2 times in this particular study. And then we're doing some work with the routinely collected resident data. So we did these interviews in between February and April last year, and we did 105 of them. And we took a cross-section of care aides, nurses, allies, and the leaders. 6 themes emerged from these, and I won't talk about all these. And these are not surprising themes. High levels of quite severe distress at the severe distress of residents, the impact of one worksite policies, the unrelenting and really extraordinary high levels of workload, the communication challenges, broadly the mental health impact on them, and then some talk about resilience and coping, because that was there too. So this is a really super high level, but I just want to give you a flavor of it. The distress at the resident decline was palpable for all the reasons listed on the left. And Samir mentioned how Denmark, for example, moved very quickly away from the severe isolation and lockdown that we were months moving away from in Canada. This is an LPN saying the impact on the residents, that was the most depressing few months I think I've ever witnessed. There was a lot of depression, there was isolation. Pleas, desperate pleas for family to come in. They want you to just sit with them. They are so lonely, and they didn't leave their rooms for 3 months. I would have lost my mind. They were unable to recognize staff. Older adults with dementia have sensory challenges anyway, and then you dress the staff up in PPE when they finally had PPE, in masks and gowns, and their voices are muffled and they don't recognize their face. Familiarity is the friend of someone with dementia. So they became increasingly anxious and frightened sometimes. There was not adequate personal care and during some periods of time in some homes. There was just a lack of basic human touch. So here's a care aide. So I have a full-grown, full mask, gloves, a shield. He's hard of hearing. I'm trying to have what's probably a really important conversation that takes a lot of tact, right? This was actually an LPN. And I want to convey my caringness. I remember being frustrated that day because I couldn't, and he couldn't hear me, so I'm yelling. And it's like an emotional conversation to have anyway with someone who's palliative at the end of life. They had a lot of what you might call cognitive dissonance. It was a balance between managing risk and safety and managing quality of life. So the things they were doing and being told to do, the isolation and the barring of visitors, were to reduce the risk of infection spread, but had a terrible deleterious impact on quality of life. And there was a lot of fear that they would infect their own families, fear that they would infect the residents, and on and on. So here's a care aide. I think of these people and these residents as my parents, my family, my grandparents. I just want to help. A gentleman left alone in his room asking me over and over, why are you being so mean to me? What did I do wrong? They also had a loss of the rituals of grief and mourning. In the most devastated homes that we were in and did interviews in, it was so bad, and they had such a high death toll that some weeks, and one in particular I remember, all they could talk about was toe tags, excuse me, and body bags. That is not the way that why people go to work in long-term care. There are always high levels of death because it's the last place that most people go to. But the rates and the conditions under which people pass were so difficult for the staff. And the burnout levels and the depression levels and the insomnia levels and all those things were quite high. And this is just a summary. And I'll just read one of these. This is from a manager. There were a few mornings I'd come in and I should have had 6 aides and 2 LPNs, and there was me and 2 care aides to run this floor of 34 people sick with COVID. It was traumatizing. It was probably the worst experience of my 40 years in nursing. The people who had COVID in nursing homes and who died, they were exactly as sick as the people who died in ICUs. They were just in a nursing home, not an ICU. So these were incredibly sick people. And these staff have lived through an extraordinarily traumatizing time, as have families. And we are going to have to attend to the consequences of that over the next years, because some of them are going to develop PTSD, and that will go on for years. Some of them, and we've been measuring some of these other things, and we know that they have higher levels of anxiety and depression and insomnia and a host of other things. That burnout has worsened, especially in the manager group, and that job satisfaction has dropped. And not only do we not have the conditions in long-term care in place to manage the pandemic, but we don't have the conditions in place to manage supporting a workforce that's been through something like this. This was just one manager who said, when this is done, I'm out, but this was my Crimean War. And for nursing, that's a particular poignant statement. There were some silver linings. They all talked about greater team cohesiveness. I shouldn't say all. The majority of them did. There were some homes where it wasn't as obvious. In times of trouble, that's where your team comes together, becomes close. We grew because our team became more close during the pandemic. It showed me that we have it in us to actually deliver really good care, even in the worst situation. And we have, some brave people who might be just as brave as soldiers, though they don't, carry a gun. So there was a lot of, and when we talk about what is needed to support people, employee assistance programs aren't working. They haven't been working for a long time. They could be redesigned from the bottom up and co-designed with different levels, because what we learned from the care aides, for example, is that they didn't have the resources, nor were they inclined to use some of the things that, for example, the managers use. They turned to their family, their work team, and they turned to their community, maybe their cultural community, and they turned to their faith. And when they talked about it, it was about the connectedness that were present in those different configurations. And the people who do trauma research will tell you that the need for human connection is one of the most important things we need to address when people have been through these experiences. And connection can come in all kinds of ways. And there's 1,000 things we could be doing to help that don't cost $1 million to put in place in terms of offering options and having employee assistance programs that help people guide themselves toward some good options, and some programs that could be put in place in workplaces that would help people with coping with these sorts of things when they happen, and when they happen again, which of course they will.